Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd cover very rapidly 6 phenomena that bear on the politics of trade and globalization, particularly for the U.S. and with a special focus on Asia. So first of the 6 phenomena, the pace of globalization. My favorite set of numbers comes from the British economic historian Angus Maddison, who calculates that global GDP increased tenfold between 1950 and 2000. So in 50 years, he calculates the global GDP increased tenfold. The previous tenfold increase took 200 years, from 1750 to 1950. There was no previous tenfold increase in global GDP, but there was a previous fivefold increase, which took from the year 1 to the year 1750. And if you look at the years since 2000, the acceleration that Madison saw between 1950 and 2000 has vastly outpaced his calculations. So you have a pace of globalization now that has intensified considerably from the tenfold GDP increase he calculated in the most recent 50-year period. So this acceleration of global growth has no historic parallel. And the level of economic integration globally has 6 or 7 dimensions. Trade flows, obviously, which account for a third of global GDP. In 1950, trade flows were 10% of global GDP. Investment flows, $500 billion to $1.5 trillion annually. The U.S., China, the EC are the biggest targets. An example of the importance of investment flows and their impact. In 1960, there were about 7,000 multinational corporations, and today there are over 70,000 multinational corporations. Capital flows, $2 trillion a day slosh around the world, relatively unimpeded. Communications, of course, has enhanced the pace of globalization in all of the ways we all know from personal experience. Logistics and transportation costs are way down. It costs less to ship something from China than it does to truck it from the interior of Mexico. Security, it doesn't feel this way, but conflicts among great powers are at their lowest level in history, even though most Americans would tell you they feel less secure. And last, all of this integration has been pushed ahead by 12 rounds of global trade talks and by a series of bilateral and multilateral agreements among countries that crisscross the world. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these as a means on the bilateral side, not just to increase trade flows, but as Dennis was saying, really exemplars of security-related issues, building alliances, and extending one's power and influence through those with which it trades. So, point 1 is that the global economy is more integrated, growing faster under the pressures of technology, trade, and capital than ever before in the history certainly of our country, and my guess is in history. Second trend, the reemergence of China and the integration of Asia around China as the productive hub. This phenomena, the reemergence of China, is a function of many things, but including a marrying of capital and technology, particularly from 5 wealthy Asian countries, and large manpower reserves and low costs of the Chinese. This is a marriage in which complementarities that have sprung up over many, many years have been realized. So this reemergence of China and Asia in general is a structural shift in the global economy. It is the integration of what had been previously separate Asian economies into something much more powerful. We all grew up at a time when China was over here in this quadrant with North Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, Burma at that time, and the wealthy Asian countries were over here. Japan, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the wealthy Asian nations. This group of nations followed a U.S. model post-World War II. China followed its own model post-World War II, a communist model. That's how we all grew up. But the fact is, until roughly the early 1800s, Asia had always been loosely integrated around China for thousands of years. Thousands of years. The Japanese word for coin, yen, the Korean word for coin, won, are Chinese words for coin. They're derivatives of Chinese words. So we grew up in an anomalous period of Asian history. Asia was cleaved in two in part by European colonialization in the 1800s and late 1700s, and then completely split apart by the Communist Revolution in China in 1949. So what happens? You have nations in this column, particularly China, particularly Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, following a much more Western economic model led initially by Japan, growing in economic power, growing in technological prowess, growing in financial heft. On this side of the equation, you have China. Remains isolated from this early wave of Asian growth, post-1950, stays rural, low cost, and a ton of people. And then what happens? China effects internal economic reform, following Deng Xiaoping's comments in the late 1960s, begins opening up urban areas, begins creating special economic zones, begins liberalizing slowly the movement of labor, begins a process of decollectivization of farms, so on and so forth. Then Japan in 1972 normalizes relations with China. 1975, they have a treaty. 1979, Japan's giving China overseas development assistance, foreign aid, in massive amounts. 1980, not coincidentally, China starts opening special economic zones and begins that experiment in economic liberalization. Then what happens? Taiwan opens to mainland investment in 1995. Hong Kong reverts to China in 1997. China enters the WTO in 2000. And so what you end up having is a meshing of the financial and technological strength that had built up among these particularly 5 wealthy Asian nations and large manpower reserve, low costs of China. 4 effects are immediately the result. Number 1, Asian trade has shifted dramatically toward China and within Asia itself. The last time Japan traded more with China than with the U.S. was in 1879. It trades more with China than with the U.S. today. Second, Asia has become vastly more competitive, as against the U.S. and as Europe, and I believe that trend will continue absent some action by the U.S. and Europe. Third, the diplomatic and political heft of Asia has increased enormously, and particularly of China, which has become something of a regional agenda setter, a role once unquestioningly Japan's. And fourth, you look at the reserve accumulation in these countries, which is now on the order of well over 2 trillion. China's 1.4, 1.5 itself. And what you have are countries that are very wealthy, that now have embarked on very active outward investment flows. China, in particular, the creation of sovereign wealth funds, which is now a global phenomenon, and in the case of China, a massive global resource hunt, which has profound implications. So, like EC integration, this is the creation of a kind of Asian union. But it has emerged much faster, and it has been driven not by government blueprints, but by the economics, and is therefore, in many respects, quite a bit more powerful. Third trend, the integration of these Asian economies and the competitive pressures coincide with a period of U.S. weakness. Our national finances are in chaos. Our competitiveness is in sharp question. Just look at our spending on basic research and development, which has been falling relative to GDP since 1970. This is inexcusable. You look at our education system, particularly K through 12. How is it that a fourth grader in the U.S. ranks very favorably against Asian nations in math? And by the end of high school, our kids rank 28th of 30 in math. What has happened between fourth grade and the end of high school in this country? So to Dennis's point, we better raise our game at home, or I think we are in a heap of trouble. Fourth trend, this reemergence of Asia, the growth of trade, the pressure of globalization has disrupted settled industries in the United States. Loss of manufacturing jobs have been going on since the mid-1960s, and yet our manufacturing output is greater today than it has ever been, and that is largely a function of productivity and the incorporation of IT advances, particularly in manufacturing. But we now also see from the outsourcing debate that there is potential disruption to white-collar jobs, which is a new phenomenon. And this all calls into question two assumptions made in the 1990s, which weren't false, but were a little on the incomplete side. One assumption was the U.S. would shed manufacturing jobs, but would retain its lead in knowledge-based industries. Second assumption was that the opening of foreign markets would be a clear competitive win for the United States because we were the leading knowledge-based countries. So what actually has happened, open markets have in fact fed U.S. exports, but they've also fed global growth, and China's in particular, including in light industry and in heavy manufacture, where U.S. job loss has been most severe. And second, the U.S. tech lead and the jobs displaced manufacturing workers were going to shift to never materialized. You had the tech bubble burst in the year 2000. And so now you have two disaffected classes. You have disaffected blue-collar workers. You also have a growing cadre of disaffected white-collar workers. Fifth trend, the U.S. anti-trade penchant is nothing new. This is our history. We've only had one brief respite from it. So in 1790, Thomas Jefferson had to defend trade with low-wage jurisdictions. And in the 1920s, Albert Einstein got into the act and started talking about the fact that machines were going to outpace man, and, well, so go jobs. And then you have Herbert Hoover. I needn't say more on that one. The only respite we've had from a fear of trade, a fear of competition with lower wages, was 1945 to 1965, right? We were the only show in town from 1945 to 1965. There was no competition. The global economy had been shattered, basically, by World War II, and we were the last person standing. What happens after 1965? Interestingly, the early sort of notions of mandatory trade deficit reduction and so on were targeted at Germany. Then it moved to Japan. Then it moved to the Asian tigers, right? Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, everybody got into the act in terms of the need for mandatory deficit reduction, unfair trade, so on and so forth. We had auto quotas, we had steel quotas, increased support for American agriculture during that period. All of this activity established on two false propositions. Number one, that trade deficits meant unfair trade, when in fact trade deficits have virtually nothing to do with unfair trade, only in minor respect. Trade deficits are much more a function of the fact that Americans will buy anything that moves, whether we can afford it or not. And second, the notion that old manufacturing jobs will come back if we could just protect our borders. Both of these assumptions are false. But the notion that trade deficits are a function of unfair trade, this was courtesy of Richard Nixon, who made this observation in 1959, 1960, and that observation has governed ever since. It's now become bedrock, even though it is wrong. And then what happened? You had NAFTA, which was the worst possible agreement at the worst possible time. I'm very pro-NAFTA by the way. And that is, no, I am. And that is to say, trade with low-wage country, oh my God, on our border, at a time when U.S. hysteria over trade was at one of its many peaks. What was the effect of NAFTA? The overselling of trade agreements to get them passed. Well, when you oversell an agreement, by definition, it never measures up, leading to disappointment, leading to the I told you so, leading to increased polarization, and with every succeeding trade agreement, fewer and fewer and fewer votes. So if you don't hold the vote open well past due date, you don't get enough votes to pass these agreements. Certainly, if you look at polling, Americans understand the value of trade, they understand the value of exports, but as soon as questions revolve around trade as related to personal finances or community stability, even college-educated Americans will turn against trade. So we've had quite a spiral, but this spiral is not new. We've been saddled with anti-trade sentiment almost since the creation of the country. And sixth trend, presidential election. The low point, to my mind, in the debates, who hates NAFTA more? As though this were a relevant question, which was really remarkable to me. No discussion of Asia. No discussion of the American competitive position. No discussion of the way in which this country has grown and why we have been the economic juggernaut that we have. No discussion of any of that, but a discussion of NAFTA, an agreement done with what was at the time our number 2 and number 3 trading partners, which remain, well, our number 2 and number 4 trading partners. So, response to the last 2 points. The U.S. response with respect to all of this will, fortunately, be somewhat constrained. Why? Number one, Asia is our banker. That's where the bulk of reserves are. That's who we borrow from. And as Bill Clinton's found saying, you don't grab a cup of coffee, go down to your banker and say, I want to talk about your behavior. That's point one. Point two, we're constrained somewhat by the WTO. Can't arbitrarily raise tariffs. Can't impose quotas. Well, we could, but we would pay compensation of an extraordinary amount. Third, financial integration. Why has sovereign wealth fund support of major U.S. financial institutions accepted by the Congress? There's relatively little blowback because no one wants to mess with the financial system, which most members of Congress, and I think most Americans, don't understand in any event, but know that you could do some real serious damage, which would be problematic. And last, of course, we're constrained by the geopolitics. Trade is a form of security. It is a basis for, and sometimes the only basis for, geopolitical engagement. And so there will be some degree of natural constraint. And on the policy side, what should the U.S. do? 4 big categories. Number one, reduce the risks posed by the massive financial imbalances that exist globally. We can talk about this in Q&A. Number two, as Dennis said, raising our game at home. We better start looking inward and getting our own house in order. Third, re-engaging in Asia in a meaningful way and reinforcing what had been the American central place in the Asia region, which has waned over the course of many years, compounded by American distraction. And last, the U.S. has to look again at our relationship with China, and China has to undertake far greater responsibility for the global economy than it has done to date. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, and I think
than it has done to date. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, and I think